get comfortable. Tonight you are going to sit down to dinner in a Victorian house, at a table laid with more silver and glass than you have ever seen at one meal, and you are going to discover that this dinner, this pleasant social evening among friends, was one of the most nerve-wracking, rule-bound, and quietly exhausting ordeals that respectable society could put a person through. You have probably imagined a Victorian dinner party as a scene of ease and abundance. The candlelight, the glittering table, the courses flowing out of the kitchen, the guests at their leisure, the whole warm and golden picture that the period dramas have given us. And the candlelight was real, and the abundance was real, and the glitter was certainly real. But underneath the golden surface, a Victorian dinner party was something far more strained and far more interesting. It was a test. It was, in the words that the age itself used, the great trial, the single occasion on which a family's breeding, its wealth, its command of 1,000 tiny rules, was laid bare before the sharp and merciless judgment of its social equals. Every dish, every glass, every movement of a fork was watched and read and remembered, and the getting of it right, or the getting of it wrong, could raise a family's standing or sink it. Before we go any further, if you enjoy this kind of history, the close and human and richly detailed kind, take a moment to subscribe and to leave a like. It helps this small channel more than you would think. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what the hour is where you are. I always like to know who is out there in the quiet. Now let the room grow still and let us go back. It is the year 1880. The place is England, the dining room of a good house in a prosperous district, the home of a family of the comfortable upper middle class, the sort of family that has done well and means everyone to know it. Tonight they are giving a dinner, a proper dinner party, and you are one of the guests, arriving now in the early evening, in your finest evening dress, a little nervous, as everyone always was, at the door of a house where you are about to be tested for the next 3 hours without a single moment's respite, and without anyone ever admitting that a test is what it is. We are going to sit through this dinner together, from the arrival in the drawing room to the last glass of wine, course by course, rule by rule, and we are going to see what this famous and formidable institution, the Victorian dinner party, was truly like from the inside. It was a great deal of things. Restful was not one of them. Let us begin. Here is the thing to understand before we go in, the thing that explains everything that is about to happen, and it is this. The dinner party was not really about the food. The food was superb, and there was a great deal of it, and we will taste every course of it before the evening is done. But the food was the occasion, not the purpose. The purpose was social, and it was serious, and it was ruthless. The dinner party was the arena in which the Victorian middle and upper classes performed and tested their belonging to the class they claimed. Consider what was being judged all evening under the candlelight. The host and hostess were being judged on the whole management of the thing, the quality of the table, the excellence of the food, the smoothness of the service, the correctness of every arrangement. For a dinner that went wrong in any visible way was a humiliation that the whole social circle would hear of, and the guests were being judged too, every one of them, on their command of the intricate code of behavior that governed every second of the meal, the right fork and the right word and the right degree of everything. For a guest who revealed, by some small error, that they did not truly know the rules, revealed that they did not truly belong, and belonging was the whole game. This is why the age called it the Great Trial, and meant it. A dinner party was an examination in which everyone present was simultaneously a candidate and an examiner, watching and being watched, judging and being judged. And the subject of the examination was nothing less than whether you were truly one of the class you sat among, or merely an impostor who had learned some of the manners but would, sooner or later, betray yourself with a wrong move. The stakes were real, social standing was real, and it was fragile, and it was made and unmade at exactly such occasions as this one. So as we go into dinner, understand that beneath the pleasure and the abundance and the candlelight, everyone at this table is working hard all evening at the anxious business of proving that they belong. Keep that in mind. It is the thing the golden picture leaves out, and it is the truth of the evening. You arrive at the correct hour, which is a matter of some delicacy, for a Victorian dinner ran on a strict clock, and arriving at the wrong time was the first of the evening's many possible errors. Too early, and you caught your hosts unready, which was an awkwardness. Too late, and you kept the whole party waiting, and the dinner spoiling, which was a real offense, for the dinner was timed to the minute, and a late guest threw the whole delicate machinery out. So you arrive within the narrow correct window, a few minutes after the hour named on the invitation, and you are admitted, and your outer things are taken, and you are shown up to the drawing room, where the party gathers before the dinner is announced. The half hour or so in the drawing room before dinner was its own small act of the evening, and it had its own tensions. Here, the guests assembled, greeted their hosts and one another, and made the light preliminary conversation that filled the time until the meal was ready. It was a period of assessment, the guests taking one another's measure, the company sorting itself out, everyone conscious of who else was present and what that said about the standing of the occasion and their own place in it. And it was a period of a particular quiet anxiety, for something important was about to be revealed that governed the whole shape of the evening to come, and that was the question of who would take whom in to dinner. For the guests did not simply wander into the dining room and sit where they liked. Nothing so casual. The procession into dinner was arranged in advance by the hosts, according to the strict laws of precedence, and it paired each gentleman with the lady he would escort to the table and sit beside through the meal. The host would tell each gentleman, quietly, which lady he was to take in, and the pairing mattered enormously, for it was governed by rank and status, and it announced, to everyone watching, exactly where each guest stood in the pecking order of the evening. To be taken in by the host himself, or to be taken in first, was an honor that marked your importance. To be paired far down the order was a quiet message about your place. The whole company was, in effect, ranked and sorted in these few minutes before dinner, and the ranking was made visible to all in the order of the procession, and everyone understood exactly what it meant. This business of precedence deserves a closer look, because it ran through the whole evening, and it reveals the machinery of rank that lay beneath the pleasant social surface of the dinner. Precedence, in Victorian society, was the settled order of social rank, the fixed system by which every person's exact standing relative to every other was determined and expressed. It governed who entered a room first, who sat where, who was served before whom, who took precedence over whom in 100 small daily situations, and it was worked out to a fine and formal degree. There were rules, elaborate and precise, that fixed the rank of every position in society, the peer above the baronet, and the baronet above the knight, the ranks of the clergy, and the professions and the rest, and within each rank the finer gradations of seniority, and the whole assembled into a single vast ladder on which every respectable person occupied a known and definite rung. At a dinner party, this abstract system became suddenly and intensely concrete, for the seating of the table was a direct physical expression of the precedence of the guests. The most honored guests sat nearest the host and hostess, at the head and foot of the table, and the honor of a place declined as it moved down the table toward the middle, so that where you sat was a public statement of your rank in the assembled company. The hostess had to work all this out beforehand, and it was one of the harder parts of giving a dinner, the arranging of the guests so that each was placed according to their due precedence, no one set below their proper station, which would offend them, and no one set above it, which would offend others. It was a delicate calculation, and an error in it, a guest misplaced, a precedence muddled, was a real failure of hospitality that would be noticed and resented. There is something almost hard to believe, from our vantage, in the seriousness with which all this was taken, the idea of grown people keenly conscious of exactly who outranked whom, and deeply concerned about the precise placing of themselves and others at a dinner table. But it was not silliness, or not only silliness, it was the visible working of a society organized to its core around rank and place, a society in which knowing your position and everyone else's, and observing the order that position dictated, was fundamental to the whole social system. The dinner table, with its careful seating by precedence, was that system made visible and edible, the abstract ladder of rank rendered concrete in the arrangement of bodies around a table, and everyone at the table read it fluently and knew exactly what it said. The very hour at which this dinner is held tells a story worth pausing on, for the timing of dinner had drifted across the whole century in a way that mapped, precisely, the movements of fashion and class, and the late hour of your dinner tonight was itself a mark of standing. In an earlier age, dinner had been a midday meal, taken in the middle of the day as the main meal of it, as it still was, in 1880, among the laboring classes and the country folk who ate their dinner at noon and their supper at night. But among the fashionable and the comfortable, the dinner hour had crept steadily later and later across the decades, from the early afternoon to the late afternoon to the evening, until by 1880 a fashionable dinner was an evening meal taken at 7:30 or 8 by candlelight as the grand social meal of the day. And the lateness was the point, or part of it, for to dine late was to announce that you did not labor, that your day was not governed by the early hours and the midday dinner of the working world, that you belonged to the leisured classes who could dine at 8 because they need not rise at dawn to work. The dinner hour, in other words, was a class marker as precise as any other, and the drift of it later and later through the century was the fashionable classes forever distancing themselves from the hours of the workers below. To dine at noon was common, to dine at 8 was genteel, and the whole elaborate evening dinner party, with its candlelight and its formality and its many courses, existed in part because dinner had moved into the evening and become the grand social occasion of the day, the meal that could be made into a ceremony precisely because it no longer sat in the middle of the working day, but crowned the leisured evening of people who had the whole long day to prepare for it. The late hour and the grand dinner went together, each the product of the same leisure, the same distance from the world of labor, the same careful marking of the boundary between those who dined and those who merely ate. And the shift had created, along the way, a whole new meal to fill the gap it left. For when dinner moved to the evening, it left the middle of the day empty, and into that emptiness came luncheon, the light midday meal, and the afternoon tea that filled the long stretch between luncheon and the now distant dinner. The whole shape of the genteel day, with its luncheon and its afternoon tea, and its late grand dinner, was the product of this drift of the dinner hour into the evening, the daily rhythm of the comfortable classes reorganized around the late dinner that had become the center and summit of their eating day. The dinner you sit down to tonight, at its fashionable evening hour, sat at the top of that whole reorganized day, the grand evening event toward which the lighter meals had pointed, the summit of the genteel day's eating, held late, by candlelight, in the leisured evening that its very lateness proclaimed. The dinner is announced. A servant appears at the drawing-room door and tells the hostess that dinner is served, and the company assembles itself for the procession. The host offers his arm to the lady of highest rank present and leads the way. Each gentleman finds the lady he has been assigned, offers her his arm, and the couples fall in behind in their order of precedence, and the whole party proceeds, 2 by 2, from the drawing-room to the dining-room, in a slow and formal parade that was itself a small ceremony and a public ordering of the company. The hostess, by custom, came last, on the arm of the gentleman of highest rank, bringing up the rear of the procession she had arranged. And so you come into the dining-room, on the arm of your assigned gentleman, and you see the table, and the table is a spectacle designed to take exactly the breath it takes. It is long, and it is covered in a cloth of white damask, starched and pressed to a flawless smoothness, and down its length runs a blaze of light and color and gleaming things. There are candles, in candelabra of silver, throwing the warm and living light that was the only flattering light the age had, and that made the whole table glitter. There are flowers, arranged along the center, for by 1880 the fashion for flowers on the dinner table was well established, great arrangements of them running down the middle of the cloth. There is fruit, piled in dishes, part of the decoration as much as the eating, and there is, above all, the gleam of silver and glass and porcelain, spread the length of the table in a quantity that announced, more directly than anything else could, the wealth and standing of the house. Those flowers running down the center of the table deserve a closer look, for the decoration of the dinner table had become, by 1880, an art and an industry in its own right, and it carried its own freight of meaning and expense. The fashion for flowers on the dinner table was itself a fairly recent thing, for in the earlier part of the century, when the food had been set out on the table in the French style, there was no room for elaborate floral decoration, and it was even thought that the scent of flowers would war with the aroma of the food. But when the food moved off the table and onto the sideboard, in the new Russian style, the center of the table was left free, and into that freed space came the decoration, the flowers and the ferns and the fruit and the ornament, until the center of a fashionable dinner table became a running display of floral art, arranged with great care and considerable cost, one more field on which the household's taste and resources were shown. And the flowers were no small expense, for fine flowers, out of their season, in the quantity a grand table wanted, were a luxury, grown in hothouses, or bought from the florists, at prices that mounted quickly. The great arrangements that ran down the center of a fashionable table, the ferns and the exotic blooms, the whole elaborate floral centerpiece, represented a real outlay, renewed for each occasion, the flowers of a single evening, wilting into worthlessness by the morning. It was display in its purest form, beauty bought at expense for a single evening's effect, and it announced, as everything on the table announced, the resources of a household that could spend so freely, on so transient a splendor. The table was a stage, and the flowers were part of its dressing, and the dressing was costly, and the costliness was the message, spoken in blooms that would be dead by morning, but that did their work, in the candlelight, of proclaiming the wealth and the taste of the house. Beyond the flowers lay the whole art of the table's setting, the arrangement of the silver and the glass and the china into the ordered, gleaming array that met the diner's eyes, and this, too, was a considered art, governed by rule and fashion, the placing of everything just so, the whole surface of the table composed into a picture of order and abundance and richness. The laying of a grand table was a skilled labor, the province of the butler and the servants who knew exactly how it should be done, every piece in its correct place, the whole assembled into the glittering composition that announced, before a single course was served, that this was a house that knew how such things were done and had the means to do them. The table, before the meal even began, was already speaking, already displaying, already making the statement of standing and taste and wealth that the whole evening existed to make. Look closely at the place that has been laid for you, because the setting at each seat was a small arsenal of specialized equipment, and it tells you a great deal about the meal to come and about the whole Victorian genius for turning eating into a test of knowledge. Before you, ranged around the plate, is an array of silver, and there is a great deal of it, far more than a modern place setting holds. There are knives, several of them, and forks, several of them, and spoons, and each one is designed for a particular course and a particular food, and each must be used for its proper purpose, and no other. And using the wrong one was one of the classic and most dreaded errors of the Victorian table. There is a knife and fork for the fish, made differently from the others, for the eating of fish had its own dedicated implements by this date. There is the knife and fork for the meat. There are the spoons for the soup, and for the various other courses that a spoon was wanted for. Above the plate, or to the side, the implements for the dessert, and a whole further set of specialized tools that the age had invented for particular foods, the oyster fork, the fruit knife, and the rest, each with its narrow and specific and non-negotiable use. This proliferation of specialized cutlery was new, a product of exactly this Victorian period, and it was not an accident. The manufacturers made it, and the etiquette required it, and together they produced a situation in which the correct navigation of a dinner required a real body of specialized knowledge, the knowing of which implement went with which course, in an age when to reach for the wrong one was to advertise your ignorance to the whole table. And this was, in its way, the point. The very complexity of the equipment was a barrier and a test. Someone raised to it, from childhood, in a family that dined this way, knew the whole system without thinking, used the right tool by pure habit, moved through the meal with an unconscious fluency that marked them, unmistakably, as belonging. Someone who had risen recently, who had the money for the dinner but not the lifetime of training, might know the rules in their head but lacked the deep habit, and under the pressure of the table might falter, reach wrong, reveal themselves. The forks were a filter. They sorted the truly bred from the merely arrived, and everyone at the table knew it and watched. And beside the array of silver stood the glasses, and the glasses were their own announcement, for at a proper Victorian dinner, each course had its own wine, and each wine its own glass. And so before each place there stood not one glass, but a cluster of them, several glasses of different shapes and sizes, one for the sherry, and one for the hock, and one for the champagne, and one for the claret, and the rest ranged ready for the succession of wines that would accompany the succession of courses through the evening. The cluster of glasses at each place was a promise of the abundance to come, and a display of it in advance. And one more piece of equipment whose correct use, which wine in which glass at which moment, formed part of the knowledge the evening tested. The china on which all this food was served deserves its own attention, for the dinner service was one of the great possessions of a Victorian household, and one of the clearest displays of its standing that the whole table offered. A well-appointed household aspired to own not one set of dishes, but several, each for its purpose: the everyday set for ordinary family meals, the breakfast set, the dessert service with its own particular decoration, and above all, the best dinner service, the grand matched set brought out for occasions such as this one. And a dinner service was a considerable thing, a matched set of many pieces, the plates in their several sizes for the several courses, the tureens and the dishes and the platters, all decorated alike in the pattern the household had chosen, the whole forming a coordinated set that might run to a great many pieces and cost, in the finer porcelains, a very great deal of money. The owning of a fine, large, matched service, enough to serve a grand dinner without a single mismatched piece, was a real mark of standing, and the bringing of it out for a dinner party was part of the display, the table set with the gleaming matched porcelain that announced, in its quality and its completeness, the resources of the house. The finest services were of porcelain, the hard white translucent ware that had been the luxury of luxuries when it first came from China in earlier centuries, and that the English potteries now made in their own right, the great manufacturers of the Staffordshire potteries, producing the fine wares that graced the tables of the comfortable classes. A service from one of the celebrated makers, richly decorated, gilded perhaps, painted with flowers or scenes, or the family's own crest, was a possession of real value and real pride, displayed at dinner as both the vehicle of the food and an ornament in its own right, the plates admired as objects even as they carried the courses, and the whole matched gleaming array of it, spread the length of the table, was part of the composed splendor that met the diner's eyes, one more element of the display, one more statement in the language of standing that the whole table spoke. And behind the display, as always, lay a labor and a care, for fine porcelain was fragile and precious, and its keeping was a responsibility. The best service was washed by hand, with particular care, by the most trusted of the servants, or sometimes by the mistress herself, for a breakage in the fine service was a real loss, an expensive piece gone from a matched set that could not easily be replaced. It was counted and checked and kept locked away between its uses, brought out for the grand occasions and returned to its safe keeping after, treated with the care its value warranted. The gleaming plates that carried your dinner tonight were precious things, kept and guarded and tended, brought out for this evening's display, and to be washed and counted and locked away again when the great dinner was done, one more of the treasures of the house pressed into the service of the evening's great statement of standing and wealth. There is one more object at your place, small and easily overlooked, and it is the key to the whole evening's structure, and that is the menu card, a small printed or handwritten card, standing at each place or shared between two, that listed the courses of the dinner in order, the whole progression of the meal set out from the soup to the dessert, so that each guest knew what was coming and could pace themselves through the long succession of dishes. The menu card was itself a mark of the style of service that this dinner followed, and to understand the evening, we must understand that style, for it shaped everything. This dinner is served in the manner called à la Russe, in the Russian style, and the phrase names one of the great changes in how the Victorians ate, a change that had swept through respectable society in the decades just before 1880 and transformed the dinner party into the thing it now was. In the older style, the style called à la Française, the French style, that had prevailed in the earlier part of the century, all the dishes of a course were placed on the table together, set out in a grand symmetrical display, and the diners helped themselves and one another from the dishes within their reach, and the host carved the great joints at the table. It was a magnificent style in its way, the loaded table, the abundance all displayed at once. But it had its drawbacks, and chief among them was that food set out to be admired grew cold while it was admired, and a diner could reach only the dishes near them and missed the rest. The new style, the à la Russe style, changed all this. Now the food was not set out on the table at all, or only the decorations were. Instead, the dishes were carved and portioned at a side table by the servants, and brought to each guest in turn, already served, one course at a time, in a strict sequence, each course appearing, being eaten, and being cleared away before the next appeared. The food came hot from the kitchen to the plate. Each course had the table's whole attention in its turn, and the meal became a procession, a sequence of separate courses following one another in order, which is why each guest needed a menu card to know the shape of the evening, and which is the style of dining, course following course, that we still know today. This change in the style of service, from the French to the Russian, sounds like a small matter of table arrangement, but it reached far deeper than that, and it is worth understanding what it actually did, because it reshaped the whole social machinery of the dinner, and it bore down, in particular, on the people below stairs. The à la Russe style, for all its elegance, made enormous new demands on the servants, and this was its hidden cost. In the old French style, the host carved, and the diners served themselves, and the servants, though busy, had a limited role at the table itself. In the new Russian style, everything depended on the servants. They carved, at the side table, out of sight, every joint and bird. They portioned every dish. They carried every course to every guest, in the correct order, serving from the correct side, keeping pace with the progress of the meal, managing the whole complex flow of many courses to many guests, without confusion or delay. A dinner à la Russe required a substantial staff of trained servants, moving in practiced coordination, and the more courses and the more guests, the more servants were needed, and the whole thing fell apart without them. This is why the à la Russe dinner became, among other things, a display of exactly this, of the household's command of servants. You could not give a proper dinner in this style without the staff to serve it, and so the style itself announced your resources, your ability to command the trained labor that the elaborate service required. A grand dinner with many courses smoothly served was a statement that you had, or could command for the evening, the small army of servants that such service demanded, and the smoothness of the service was the visible proof of it. The guests enjoyed the smooth, unbroken flow of the courses, and that smoothness was itself a message, a demonstration of the household's staff and standing, delivered in the very manner of the serving. And behind the smooth surface, in the kitchen and the passages and at the side tables, that small army was working at full stretch, in a controlled frenzy of timing and coordination, to produce the calm and effortless flow that the diners enjoyed. The cook, who had been laboring since morning over the many dishes of the many courses, timing each to be ready at its moment. the servants carrying and serving and carving and clearing, moving in the tight choreography that the service required, under the eye of the butler who commanded the whole operation. The dinner that flowed so smoothly past the guests was, behind the scenes, one of the most intensely coordinated labors the household ever performed, and the measure of its success was precisely that the guests never saw the labor at all, but only the smooth and pleasant procession of the courses, arriving as if by magic, hot and perfect, and in their proper order, all evening long. Before the soup arrives, there is the small matter of the napkin, and the taking of one's seat, and the first few gestures of the meal, and these small openings were themselves watched and judged, for the examination began the moment you sat down. The napkin, first, that large square of fine white damask laid at your place, folded perhaps into some elaborate shape, for the folding of napkins into fans and flowers and mitres was one of the small decorative arts of the grand. You took it as you settled, and unfolded it, and laid it across your lap, and this simple act had its correct form, for the napkin went on the lap and not, as a lower usage had it, tucked into the collar or spread across the chest, and the placing of it correctly on the lap was one more of the small signals by which the bread distinguished themselves from the common. A tucked napkin marked a man as surely as a wrong fork, and the knowing laid theirs across the lap without a thought, and the watching table noted, without seeming to, who did which. And there was the whole matter of how one sat, and held oneself, at the table, for the posture and bearing of a diner were part of the performance too. One sat upright, and did not lean upon the table, and kept the elbows in, and held oneself with the ease and correctness that long training gave, for the body at the table was as much on display as the manners, and a slouching, or an awkward, or an ill-controlled body betrayed a want of breeding as clearly as any error of the forks. The whole bearing of the diner, the upright ease, the controlled and graceful movement, the correct management of the body through the long meal, was part of what the evening displayed and judged, and it had been trained into the bred from childhood, the deportment lessons and the constant correction that had produced, at last, the effortless correct bearing that marked the lady or the gentleman at the table. There was, too, the etiquette of the offered dishes, and the refusing of them, for as the courses came, a diner was not obliged to take everyone, and the declining of a dish had its own correct form, the quiet refusal, the small gesture that let a course pass without fuss. And a wise diner did decline, here and there, through the long meal, for to take a full portion of every one of the many courses was to eat an impossible quantity, and to be overcome long before the end, and the pacing of oneself through the marathon of the dinner, the judicious taking of some courses and declining of others, was one of the quiet skills of the practiced diner. The newcomer, anxious, might take everything offered and suffer for it. The seasoned diner knew how to pace the long meal, how to take a little here and decline there, how to arrive at the dessert still upright and still capable, having navigated the whole enormous succession without disaster. And this, too, was part of the art, the quiet management of one's own progress through the great trial of the table. And now the dinner begins, and it begins, as a Victorian dinner always began, with soup. You are seated, the whole company settled at last in its careful order, the napkins unfolded, the first wine poured, and the servants bring the soup. At a formal dinner, there were often two soups offered, a thick one and a clear one, and you might choose between them, or the choice might be made for you, and the soup arrived at your place already served in its plate, hot from the kitchen, the opening course of the long meal. It might be a clear consommé, delicate and golden, the labor of hours reduced to a shining clarity in the bowl. It might be a rich, thick soup, a puree or a bisque, or on the grandest occasions the famous turtle soup that was the very emblem of a luxurious table. Whatever it was eaten first, the foundation of the meal, the quiet beginning before the abundance built. And with the soup came the first of the wines, the sherry, for the matching of particular wines to particular courses was one of the strict laws of the Victorian dinner, and it began here. A little sherry, poured into its proper glass, taken with the soup and the fish that followed, the light, dry opening note of the evening's long progression of wines. The servant moved round the table with the decanter, or the wine was offered and poured, and the glass that had stood empty at your place was filled, and the drinking of the evening began as the eating did, in its proper order, by its proper rules. The soup course had its own small etiquette, of course, for every course did, and the eating of soup was one of the classic tests of a diner's breeding. The spoon was to be taken to the side of the plate, not the near edge, and moved away from you, not toward you, in the filling of it, and brought to the mouth from the side, and the soup taken without sound, for the making of any noise in the eating of soup was one of the great and unforgivable vulgarities of the table, a sure and instant mark of low breeding, and the plate was not to be tilted to get the last of it, and the spoon was to be left in the proper position when you were done. All this for the mere eating of a bowl of soup, and all of it watched, and all of it read, the first small examination of the evening, passed or failed in the first few minutes of the meal. The soup plates are cleared, swiftly and quietly, by the servants who move behind the diners, removing each course before the next appears, and the fish arrives. Fish was the second course of the classic sequence, following the soup and preceding the meats, and it was a course taken seriously, for good fish, fresh and well prepared, was a luxury and a mark of a good table, especially inland, away from the coast, where fresh fish was harder to come by, and its presence on the table said something about the reach of the household's purveyors. It might be a turbot, or a sole, or a salmon in its season, poached or filleted and sauced, brought to each guest already served, with its proper sauce and its proper accompaniments, and it was eaten with the fish knife and the fish fork, those specialized implements we noticed at the place, the fish knife with its particular broad and blunt shape, made for the lifting and separating of the flesh, rather than the cutting of it, for a sharp knife was not wanted with fish, and the using of the ordinary meat knife on fish was, once again, an error that the knowing would notice. Consider, while the fish is eaten, the sheer distance this food has traveled, and the labor it has passed through to reach your plate, for the fish course opens a window onto the whole vast system that fed a table like this one. The fish was caught, most likely, days before, in the North Sea or off some distant coast, by fishermen whose lives were hard and dangerous in a way that no one at this table would spend a moment considering. It was landed and sold and carried inland by the fast fish trains that the railways now ran, packed in ice, racing the spoilage to bring fresh fish to the inland towns. It was bought, that morning or the day before, at the market or from the fishmonger, chosen by the cook or the mistress, with a careful eye for freshness. It was cleaned and prepared and cooked in the hot kitchen below by hands that had been working since morning, and it arrived, at last, at your place, a neat portion of white flesh under its sauce, all the labor and the distance and the danger of its journey invisible in the quiet perfection of the served plate. Every course of this dinner had such a history behind it. a long chain of labor and transport reaching back from the candlelit table into the fields and the seas and the markets and the hot kitchen. And the whole art of the dinner was to make all of that vanish, to present the food as if it had simply appeared, effortless and perfect, in the golden circle of the dining room. And the wine changed with the course, as it always did, for the fish might be accompanied still by the sherry, or by a light white wine, a hock or a chablis, poured now into its own glass, the second wine of the evening taking its place in the succession. The glasses at your place were filling, one by one, as the courses passed, each course its wine, and each wine its glass. The cluster of glassware that had stood ready, now coming into use in its turn, the evening's slow procession of wines, keeping pace with its procession of food. After the fish came the entrees, and here we reach a part of the meal that a modern diner would find genuinely confusing, for the word entree has changed its meaning entirely in the years since, and the Victorian entree was not the main course that the word now names in some countries, but something else, a course that came before the main meats. The entrees were the made dishes, the more elaborate and delicate preparations of the cook's art, small refined dishes of meat or poultry or game in rich sauces, cutlets and fricassees and quenelles, and the whole repertoire of the skilled kitchen, served in the sequence after the fish and before the great roast that was the meal's centerpiece. They were, in a sense, the showpieces of the cook's skill, the dishes in which artistry, rather than mere abundance, was displayed, and a good cook was judged particularly on the entrees, the fineness and the flavor and the presentation of these made dishes being the truest test of the kitchen's quality. There might be several of them, brought in succession, each a small, elaborate creation, and with them the wine changed again to the richer wines that suited them, and the meal moved deeper into its abundance. It is worth pausing on the cook, here at the course that most displayed her art, for the cook was the hidden artist of the whole evening, and one of the most important and least visible figures in the entire production. In a household of this standing, the cook was a skilled professional, and a good one was valued and well paid, and difficult to keep, for good cooks were in demand and knew their worth. She had planned this dinner with the mistress, and then executed it, over a long day of intense and skilled labor in the hot kitchen, producing the many dishes of the many courses, each to be ready at its precise moment, the whole complex meal timed and coordinated and brought off from the confined and sweltering space of a Victorian kitchen with its coal range and its limited equipment. The entrees that arrived so delicately at the table, the fine sauces and the elaborate made dishes, were the product of real culinary art and real hard labor, and the woman who produced them would never be seen by the guests who ate them, would never be thanked or praised to her face by them, would remain below stairs, in the heat invisible, while the diners enjoyed the fruits of her skill and, if they praised anything, praised their hosts for the excellence of the table. The cook's art was real, and it was the foundation of the whole evening, and it was, like so much of the labor behind the dinner, entirely hidden from the candlelit room where its results were enjoyed. And now comes the center of the meal, the course toward which everything so far has been building, the roast, the great joint, or the fine birds, that were the heart of the English dinner, and the point at which the whole table reached its fullest abundance. This was the substantial heart of the dinner, the main meat course, and it was where the English table showed its particular strength, for whatever the French might do with their sauces and their made dishes, the English prided themselves on their roast meats, the great joints of beef and mutton, the saddles of lamb, the fine roasted birds, cooked to perfection and carved and served in generous abundance. The joint was carved in the à la Russe style at the side table by the servants, out of the diner's sight, and brought to each guest, already carved and served with its accompaniments, the vegetables and the potatoes and the proper sauces, though in some houses and on some occasions the older way survived, and a great joint might be brought to the table and carved there by the host, in a last echo of the vanished French style. Either way, this was the fullest and most substantial course of the meal, the point of greatest abundance, and it was accompanied by the grandest wine. For it was with the roast that the champagne was served, and the arrival of the champagne was one of the small climaxes of the evening. Champagne, in England, was served during the substantial courses of the meal, with the roast, not saved for the dessert and the toasts as it is now, and its appearance marked the high point of the dinner, the moment of fullest richness and celebration. The servant moved round with the champagne, and the special glasses were filled, and the sparkling wine, the most festive and prized of all, accompanied the great meat course in a conjunction that the age regarded as one of the peaks of the pleasures of the table. The meal had climbed, course by course, wine by wine, to this point of fullest abundance, the roast and the champagne together, and a diner who had taken a little of every course and a glass of every wine had, by now, consumed a very great deal indeed, and the dinner was not yet even half done. Let us stop over this matter of the wines for a moment, because the succession of them through the meal was one of the strictest and most revealing of all the dinner's codes, and the whole progression tells you something about the seriousness with which the age approached the pleasures of its table. By 1880, there was a settled and rigid code of which wine went with which course, and a well-run dinner observed it exactly. Sherry with the soup and the fish at the opening of the meal, white wines, a hock or a chablis with the fish and the lighter early dishes, then the richer wines as the meal grew more substantial, and the champagne with the roast at the height of it. Then, after the roast, the great red wines, the claret and the burgundy, with the game and the later courses, the deep and serious wines that suited the fullness of the late meal. And finally, at the dessert, the sweet wines, the port and the Madeira, and the sweet dessert wines that closed the progression, each wine in its place, each matched to its course by a code that everyone of any pretension knew and observed, the whole forming a planned progression from the light dry opening to the rich sweet close, as carefully structured as the food it accompanied. The providing of all this wine was the particular responsibility of the master of the house, the one clearly male domain in the whole production of the dinner. The planning of the food and the management of the table were the mistress's work, but the wine was the master's, the selection of it and the cellaring of it, and the deciding of what should be served with what, and the manuals on wine were addressed to men, to the gentleman laying down his cellar and the butler managing it. A good cellar was a gentleman's pride and a serious expense, the laying down of fine wines to mature being an investment of both money and patience, and the wines served at a dinner were a display of the master's taste and resources, just as the food was a display of the mistress's management. The dinner was, in this sense, a joint production of the two of them, her food and his wine, her management of the table and his provision of the cellar, brought together in the single grand performance of the evening. And the quantity of it all, the sheer amount of wine that a full formal dinner poured, is worth a sober thought. For a diner who observed the whole progression, a glass of each wine with each of the many courses, drank a great deal in the course of an evening, and the Victorian dinner was, among its other characters, a considerable feat of consumption. The etiquette books, tellingly, contained cautions on the point, warnings to the inexperienced diner not to take too much of the wine, to decline where declining was proper, to remember that the long succession of glasses added up, and that a diner, overcome by the wine at the table, committed one of the worst of all social disasters. The wine flowed, generously, through the whole long evening, and the managing of one's own consumption of it, the enjoying of the abundance without being overcome by it, was one more of the quiet skills that the great trial of the dinner demanded. After the roast, if the dinner was a full one and the season allowed, came the game, and the game course was one of the marks of a truly ample and well-appointed table, for game was a luxury and a thing of season and status both. Game meant the wild birds and beasts taken in the shooting and the hunting that were among the great pursuits of the landed and the leisured, the pheasant and the partridge and the grouse, the woodcock and the snipe, the hare and the venison, brought to the table in their seasons. And game carried a particular weight of meaning, for the taking of it was tied to the ownership of land and the privileges of rank, hedged about with the game laws that reserved much of it to the landed classes, so that game on the table spoke of a connection, real or aspired to, with the world of the country estate and the shooting party, and the landed life that sat at the very summit of Victorian society. A brace of pheasant, a haunch of venison, served at a town dinner, carried a breath of that grander world into the dining room, and the serving of good game was a mark of a table with the right connections and the right standing. The game was accompanied by the great red wines, the claret and the burgundy, that we noted in the progression, the deep, serious wines that suited the rich, dark meat of the birds and the beasts. And by now, if you have followed the meal through all its courses, the soup and the fish and the entrees and the roast, and now the game, you have eaten an enormous quantity of food, course upon course of it, and drunk your way through the succession of wines, and the dinner has gone on for well over an hour, and it is still not finished, for there remain the sweet course, and the savory, and the dessert, and the whole slow ceremony of the meal's ending. The Victorian dinner was a marathon, a sustained feat of eating and drinking and social endurance that went on and on through the evening, course after course, and the getting through the whole of it, gracefully, correctly, without flagging or faltering, was itself no small accomplishment. Now the meal begins its turn towards sweetness, for after the long succession of savory courses came the sweet course, the puddings and the creams, and the elaborate confections that the Victorian kitchen delighted in, and that displayed, perhaps more than any other course, the artistry and the ambition of the cook. The sweet course, or the entremets as the finer households called it, borrowing the French, was where the kitchen showed its most decorative art, in the jellies molded in elaborate shapes and glittering with clarity, the creams and the custards, the charlottes and the trifles, the ices that required the precious ice to make and so announced by their very existence the resources of the house, and the great architectural confections, the spun sugar and the molded splendors that a skilled cook could raise into small edible monuments. These were the show dishes of the sweet kitchen, and they were made to be admired as much as eaten, brought to the table in their elaborate beauty, the cook's artistry displayed in forms that were half food and half sculpture. There was a real art to all this, and a real technical mastery, for the making of a clear jelly that held its shape, of a molded cream that turned out perfect, of an ice in an age before any easy refrigeration, of a spun sugar confection that held its delicate form, required skill and knowledge and patient labor of a high order. The cook who could produce these things was an artist in sugar and cream and gelatine, and the sweet course was her gallery, the place where her decorative ambition found its fullest scope. And the diners, by now very full indeed, took a little of this and a little of that, admired the confections, and added yet another layer to the enormous meal they had consumed, as the sweet wines began to appear in their glasses, the port and the Madeira, and the rich dessert wines that accompanied the sweetness and signaled the approach of the meal's end. And then, in a curious twist that surprises the modern diner, after all the sweetness came a small course of the savory, a single savory mouthful served at the very end, after the sweet and before the dessert proper, and it is one of the odder and more characteristic features of the Victorian dinner. The savory was a tiny dish, a mere bonne bouche, as the age called it, a single piquant mouthful of something salt or sharp, served to clear the palate of the sweetness and to close the savory side of the meal before the fruit of the dessert. It might be a soft roe on toast, or an anchovy, or a deviled morsel, or the little rolls of oyster wrapped in bacon that bore the charming name of angels on horseback, or a small cheese preparation, a cheese straw, or a cheese savory, something sharp and salt and small to end upon. And there was a class delicacy in the very existence of this course, for cheese and bread in any quantity was the food of the poor, and to eat much cheese at a fine dinner was to risk a suggestion of the common, and so the cheese, when it appeared at all at a genteel table, appeared in this tiny, refined and disguised form, a mere savory mouthful, and never as the plain bread and cheese that would have lowered the tone of the whole occasion. It is a small thing, this savory course, but it is the kind of small thing that reveals the whole anxious machinery of class that ran beneath the dinner, the constant fine calculation of what was genteel and what was common, the endless care to do everything in the way that marked you as belonging to the class above rather than the class below. Even the humble matter of cheese was caught in it, transformed from the plain food of the poor into a tiny, refined savory, precisely so that the diner might enjoy the flavor without the taint of the common, and the whole table understood the distinction perfectly and observed it without a word ever being said. That was how the code worked, everywhere, all evening, in 1,000 small things, understood and observed and never spoken, the invisible grammar of belonging written into every dish and every gesture of the meal. And so at last, to the dessert, the final course, the close of the long meal, and here the table itself changed, for the dessert had its own particular character and its own small ceremony. The dessert, in the Victorian sense, meant the fruit and the sweetmeats served at the very end, the fresh fruit and the dried fruit and the crystallized fruit, the nuts, the bonbons and the sweets and the little biscuits, arranged in fine dishes and eaten slowly at the end of the meal with the sweet wines. And for the dessert, the table was often reset, the cloth removed in some houses to reveal the polished wood beneath, the dessert service laid, the whole aspect of the table shifting from the business of dining to the slower pleasure of the close. The fruit was eaten with the special fruit knives and forks, those further specialized implements, the peeling and eating of fruit at the table being its own small performance with its own small etiquette. And the sweet wines were poured, the port beginning its journey round the table, and the pace slowed, and the long meal came, at last, toward its end. The fruit of a Victorian dessert was itself a quiet display of wealth and reach, for fine fruit, out of its season, or from far away, was a luxury that spoke of resources. The hothouse grapes and the forced strawberries, the pineapple that was the very emblem of luxury fruit, grown in the hothouses of the great estates, or imported at great expense, the oranges and the fruits from warmer lands brought by the ships of empire and trade, all of this, arriving on the dessert dishes, announced the reach of the household's purse and its purveyors. Even here, at the sweet and slowing close of the meal, the dinner went on saying what it had said all evening, in the language of the food itself, the language of abundance and reach and resource, the constant quiet announcement of the wealth and standing that the whole occasion existed to display. With the dessert came a small object that deserves a moment of its own, for it was one of the classic traps of the Victorian table, and it stands well for the whole anxious comedy of the dinner's rules, and that is the finger bowl. At the dessert, each diner was brought a small bowl of water, the finger bowl, for the rinsing of the fingers after the handling of the fruit, and the correct use of it was one of those small, precise matters that the knowing performed without thought, and the unknowing might get wrong to their cost. The fingers were dipped delicately, one hand at a time, and touched to the napkin to dry, a small, refined gesture of cleanliness at the close of the meal. But the finger bowl was famous, or notorious, as a trap for the unwary, for the newcomer who did not know its purpose, might do any number of wrong things with it, might drink from it, in the classic disaster, mistaking the bowl of water for something to be consumed, and so reveal, in one dreadful moment, the whole depth of their ignorance of the ways of the table. The story of the guest who drank from the finger bowl was one of the age's favorite cautionary tales, told and retold, the very emblem of the social catastrophe that awaited the person who did not know the rules. Whether it happened as often as the telling suggests may be doubted, but the persistence of the story tells its own truth, which is how real and how dreaded such errors were, how sharp the anxiety of the newcomer, how merciless the judgment that awaited the wrong move. The finger bowl, that small and harmless object, carried all of it, the whole weight of the table's capacity to catch and expose and judge, and a diner reaching for it with confidence, using it correctly and without thought, was passing, in that small gesture, one more of the endless tests of the evening, proving once more, as every correct gesture proved, that they knew the rules, that they belonged, that they were safe within the charmed circle of those who dined this way and knew how it was done. And there were other such traps scattered through the meal, other small, precise points where the unwary might stumble, the correct handling of this or that difficult food, the right way to deal with the awkward dishes, the asparagus and the artichoke, and the other foods that had their own particular etiquette of eating, the whole minefield of small rules that the diner had to cross without a misstep. Each was a small test, and the sum of them was the great trial, the whole evening's continuous examination in the minute particulars of genteel behavior, and the passing of it, gesture by correct gesture, was the proof of belonging that the diner had come to give and the company had come to witness. And now, with the dessert eaten and the meal complete, comes one of the most distinctive rituals of the whole evening, the moment when the company, divided by sex, the ladies withdrawing and the gentlemen remaining, in the old ceremony that gave the drawing-room its very name. When the dessert had been enjoyed and the moment felt right, the hostess caught the eyes of the ladies down the table and rose, and all the ladies rose with her, and the gentlemen rose too in courtesy, and the ladies withdrew, leaving the dining room, processing out to the drawing room, where they would gather and take coffee and wait. And the gentlemen sat down again, and stayed. At the table they now had to themselves, and the wine, the port and the claret, was passed among them, and they drank and talked, in the company of men, the ladies gone, the conversation turning to the subjects that the age held unsuitable for mixed company, the politics and the business, and the coarser talk that men indulged when the women had withdrawn. This separation had its defenders and its logic in the terms of the age. It gave the men their interval of male company and unconstrained talk, and it gave the women, gathered in the drawing-room, their own interval of female company, and both were held to be wanted. But it fell, like so much of the evening's structure, into the deep division of the sexes that ran through the whole of Victorian life, the separate spheres of men and women that the dinner enacted in its very shape, the men to their wine and their weighty talk, the women withdrawn to their coffee and their drawing-room, each sex in its proper place, the division made visible and ceremonial in the ritual of the withdrawing. And the length of the gentlemen's sitting was a delicate matter, for they were not to sit too long over their wine and neglect the ladies, and a good host judged the moment to lead the gentlemen through to rejoin the company in the drawing-room, where the whole party would come together again for the last hour of the evening, the coffee and the tea and the final conversation before the guests, at last, went home. Let us go with the ladies into the drawing-room and consider the hostess, for the whole enormous production of the evening had been, above all, her work, and the withdrawing to the drawing-room was for her less a rest than the entering of the meal's final anxious phase. The hostess had made this dinner, not with her own hands, in the cooking of it, but in the whole planning and management and direction of it, which had occupied her for days beforehand and through the whole of the day itself. The choosing of the guests and the working out of their precedents and their pairing, the planning of the menu with the cook, the deciding of every course, the arrangement of the table, the flowers, the whole setting, the management of the servants, and the timing of the service, the 100 details that had to be right, any one of which, going wrong, would show. All of this was hers, the invisible executive labor behind the smooth and pleasant evening, and she had carried it, and carried too the particular anxiety of the host, which was that her whole social standing was on display and on trial in the success or failure of the thing. For the hostess was judged, more than anyone, on the evening's success, a dinner that went well, that flowed smoothly, whose food was excellent, and whose company was pleased, raised her reputation and her family's standing, and would be spoken of approvingly through the whole circle. A dinner that went wrong, whose food disappointed, or whose service faltered, or whose arrangements betrayed some failure of taste or knowledge, was a humiliation that would equally be spoken of, and that could set a family back in the endless quiet competition of social standing. And so through the whole evening the hostess watched and managed and worried, alert to every detail, ready to smooth over any difficulty, carrying the whole weight of the occasion behind a serene and welcoming face, for the appearance of effortless ease was itself part of what she was judged on, and the enormous effort behind the ease had to be entirely hidden. Her serenity was a performance, and beneath it she was working, all evening, harder than anyone else in the room, at the anxious and demanding labor of making the whole great trial appear to be nothing at all. We have said much of the food and the wine and the ritual, but we have not yet spoken of the thing that filled the whole evening alongside the eating, the thing that was in many ways the real point of it, and that was the conversation. For a dinner party was, above all, a social occasion, and the talk across the table was its true substance, and the art of dinner conversation was one of the most demanding of all the accomplishments the evening required. There were rules, of course, for there were rules about everything. You talked, principally, to the guests on either side of you, the lady or gentleman you had been paired with, and the neighbor on your other hand, and the turning of your conversation from one side to the other was itself governed by a delicate custom, the table, as it were, turning together, so that no one was left without a partner in talk, and no one monopolized or was monopolized. The subjects of conversation were bounded by the strict Victorian sense of what was proper at a mixed table. The whole territory of the coarse, the controversial, the deeply personal, the improper, all excluded, and the talk kept to the wide, safe ground of the agreeable and the interesting and the light. To be a good dinner companion was to be able to converse easily and pleasantly and wittily across this safe ground, to draw out your neighbor, to contribute your share, to keep the talk flowing and enjoyable, hour after hour, through the whole long meal. And this was a real skill and a real labor, sustained through the entire length of the dinner. Imagine keeping up bright, correct, agreeable conversation with the strangers on either side of you, without pause, for 2 hours or more, while also navigating the whole complex business of the meal, the courses, and the cutlery, and the wines, and while conscious all the while of being watched and judged. The dinner demanded that you eat correctly, and drink moderately, and converse brilliantly, all at once, all evening, under the constant quiet scrutiny of the table, and the doing of all of it together, gracefully, was the true accomplishment that the great trial tested. A guest who could not converse, who sat silent or dull, was a failure and a burden, a weight on the table that the others had to carry. A guest who conversed well, who was charming and easy and interesting, was valued and sought after and invited again, and the conversation, like everything else, was work, pleasant work often, but work, the sustained social labor of being good company, carried on through the whole evening beneath the appearance of effortless enjoyment. Let us step back from the candlelit table for a moment, out into the dark streets of the town, and remember what else was happening on this same evening, in the same city, while this dinner ran its long and abundant course, because the contrast is the necessary other half of the picture. While you sat over your many courses, a mile away, or half a mile, or in the next street, there were households eating a very different supper, or eating almost nothing at all. The family of the laborer, sitting down to their bread and their scrape of dripping, their bit of cheese, their weak tea, the plain and scanty food of the poor, in a room that was kitchen and parlor, and often bedroom too. The family of the clerk, respectable and struggling, at their modest supper, a world away from the abundance of your table, though a world above the laborer's want. And below them all, in the worst of the courts and the lodging-houses, the truly poor, for whom a full meal of any kind was a rare and uncertain thing, and hunger a familiar companion, and the very idea of a dinner of many courses would have seemed a fantasy from another planet. The quantity of food on your table this evening, the sheer abundance of it, course after course of it, more than any of the diners could finish, would have fed many poor families for many days. This is simply a fact, and it is worth stating plainly, not to spoil the dinner, which the diners did not experience as an injustice, and mostly never thought about at all, but to see the whole picture of which the dinner was one part. The abundance of the few and the want of the many existed side by side, in the same city, on the same night, separated by a few streets and an entire world, and the dinner party, in all its glittering plenty, sat at one end of a scale whose other end was hunger. The whole arrangement of their world was designed so that they need not see it, so that the abundance could be enjoyed without the want ever intruding on the candlelit room. But it was there, in the dark beyond the curtained windows, the other half of the age, and a true account of the dinner has to see it, even though the diners did not. And what did it all cost, this one evening's abundance? The question is worth asking, for the money in a dinner party was real and large, and it reveals the scale of the investment that a family made in this single central instrument of its social standing. A dinner party of this kind was one of the more considerable expenses a household undertook, and the costs ran in many directions. There was the food itself, the finest and freshest of everything, the good fish and the fine meat, and the game and the luxury fruit, bought in quantity and quality for the occasion, a substantial outlay on its own. There was the wine, and the wine could cost more than the food, for the succession of good wines that a proper dinner required, the champagne and the fine clarets and the rest, drawn from a cellar that had itself cost a great deal to lay down, represented a real expense poured out, quite literally, in the course of a single evening. There were the extra servants, hired in for the occasion if the household's own staff was not enough to serve the dinner in the required style, for a dinner à la Russe needed hands, and the hands had to be paid. There was the wear on the fine things, the china and the glass, and the linen, and the flowers, and the candles, and the 100 small costs of the entertainment. Set it all together, and a single dinner party could cost a sum that would have kept a laboring family for months, spent in one evening, on one meal, for a dozen or so guests. And it was spent, without hesitation, as a necessary investment, for the dinner party was not an indulgence but a tool, the central instrument by which a family maintained and advanced its social position, and the money spent on it bought something the family valued above almost anything, which was standing, belonging, the reputation of a good house that entertained well. In the calculus of the age, this was money well spent, an investment in the family's place in the world, and families spent it, dinner after dinner, season after season, pouring their resources into these single glittering evenings, because the evenings bought the thing that mattered most, the secure position among their social equals that the whole of their striving was directed toward. There is a particular irony in the scale of it, when you set it beside the abundance we have watched flow across the table all evening. So much labor, so much money, so much anxious effort and skill, all poured into a single evening's eating, and the eating itself, the actual food, almost beside the point, a medium for something else. For the dinner was never really about the dinner. It was about the standing that the dinner displayed and secured, and the food and the wine and the silver and the whole glittering production were the language in which that standing was spoken, an expensive and elaborate language, costly to speak, but speaking the one thing the family most needed said, which was that they belonged, securely and unmistakably, among the people who dined like this. We have not yet spoken of how the diners were dressed, and the dress of the dinner party was its own considerable matter, for a formal dinner demanded formal evening dress, and the assembling of oneself for a dinner was a labor and an expense that came before the evening even began. For the gentleman, evening dress by 1880 had settled into the dark and formal uniform that would persist for generations, the black coat and trousers, the white shirt and white tie, the whole sober and correct costume that marked the formal evening. It was, in its way, a simplification, the men's finery of earlier ages, given up for this severe and standard dark dress, but it was strict, and it had to be right, correct, and well made, and properly worn, for a gentleman incorrectly dressed for dinner betrayed himself as surely as by any other error. For the ladies, evening dress was a far richer and more elaborate and more demanding affair, the finest and most decorative dress that a woman owned, cut low at the neck and short in the sleeve, in the way that the evening permitted and the day did not, made of the richest fabrics, silk and satin and velvet, trimmed with lace and beading and all the ornament of the age, and worn with the best jewels the household could show. The evening gown was the summit of a woman's wardrobe, the most expensive and most elaborate of all her dresses, and the appearing at dinner in the right gown, rich enough to do honor to the occasion, but not so overdone as to betray a want of taste, correct in every detail, was one more of the evening's tests. And the getting into it, the whole long labor of the formal evening toilette, the dressing, and the lacing, and the hair, and the jewels, had occupied the hour or more before the dinner, so that a woman arrived at the table already at the end of a considerable effort, assembled and armored in her finery for the ordeal ahead. And the jewels deserve their word, for the wearing of jewels at dinner was a display as pointed as any other, the diamonds and the pearls and the fine stones brought out and worn, catching the candlelight, announcing by their quality and quantity the wealth of the family and the standing of the woman who wore them. A great dinner was a blaze of jewels as much as of silver and glass, the ladies about the table gleaming with the family treasures, and the jewels too were read and assessed and remembered, one more language of display in an evening that was made of nothing else, the whole glittering assembly of the diners in their finery being itself a part of the spectacle, the human decoration of the great decorated table. Imagine, now, that you are not a seasoned diner, at ease in all this, but a newcomer, a guest of a kind, the age produced in great numbers, someone risen recently into this world, and not yet sure of its every rule, and consider what this evening was for you, because the great trial fell hardest on exactly such a person, and the age was full of them. The Victorian era was a time of great making of money and great rising of families, and the world of the comfortable classes was constantly receiving new members who had climbed into it from below. The successful man of business whose father had been a tradesman, the family newly prosperous and newly respectable, arriving in the world of dinner parties with the money to belong, but without the lifetime of training that the truly bred possessed. And for such a person, the dinner party was a minefield, an ordeal of the first order, for every one of its 1,000 rules was a rule they had learned rather than absorbed, held consciously in an anxious mind rather than known unconsciously in the body, and any of which, under the pressure of the evening, they might get wrong. Picture the anxiety of it, the array of unfamiliar cutlery, and the fear of reaching for the wrong piece, the succession of wines, and the uncertainty of which glass and how much, the complex etiquette of every course, the soup and the fish and the rest, each with its correct handling that the bred knew by instinct and the risen knew only by nervous effort. The conversation to be kept up, correct and easy, while the mind was half occupied with the terror of the forks. The whole evening, a sustained examination in a language not quite native, every moment a chance to betray, by some small wrong move, that you did not truly belong, that you were a newcomer, an impostor, one who had the money, but not the breeding. This was the great trial at its most trying, and the age knew it well, and the very existence of the etiquette books, the endless manuals that taught the rules of the table in exhaustive detail, testifies to the multitude of anxious risers studying to pass the test, to learn the code, to get through the dinner without the fatal error that would give them away. There is something both cruel and revealing in this, the way the dinner functioned as a filter and a gate, admitting the truly bred with ease and catching the newcomer in its 1,000 traps. It was, in a sense, the whole point, or one of the whole points. The elaborate difficulty of the dinner, its endless fine rules, served precisely to distinguish those who had been raised to it from those who had merely arrived, to protect the established from the rising, to make belonging a thing that could not simply be bought, but had to be learned over a lifetime or betrayed in an evening. The dinner was a defense of the class as much as a celebration of it, and the anxiety of the newcomer at the glittering table, sweating quietly over the choice of fork, was the mechanism working exactly as it was meant to work, the gate doing its job, the trial sorting the belonging from the arriving, with the fine, merciless precision that the whole system was built to achieve. Let us take in, for a while, the room itself and the whole sensory world of the dinner, for the Victorian dining room in the evening was a particular place, and its light and its warmth and its whole atmosphere shaped the experience of the meal in ways that we, in our differently lit and differently heated world, can hardly imagine. Begin with the light, for the light was everything. The room was lit by candles, by the candelabra on the table, and the candles or the lamps about the walls, and even where gas had come into the house, the dining room was often kept to candle and lamp, for the sake of the softer, warmer, more flattering light. For gas was harsh, and it fouled the air, and it was not thought fit for the room, where one dined in state. And so the dinner happened in candlelight, that living, moving, golden light, warm on the faces and the flesh, gleaming on the silver, and firing in the glass and the jewels, casting the whole room into a play of warm light and soft shadow that no modern lighting reproduces. The candlelight flattered everything, the food and the faces and the whole scene, and it gathered the diners into its warm glow, while the corners of the room fell away into shadow, and the dinner sat, as it were, in a pool of golden light against the dark, intimate and glowing and rich. The warmth of the room was considerable, for a room full of people and candles and hot food, with a fire in the grate besides, grew warm through the evening, warm and close, heavy with the mingled smells of the food and the wine, and the flowers and the candle smoke, and the warm bodies and their scents. It was a rich and heavy atmosphere, by our standards, close and warm and full of smell, the air thickening through the long evening with the accumulated scents of the meal and the company, and the diners sat in it, warm and fed and flushed with wine, in the golden light, through the long hours of the dinner. And the sound of it, the particular sound of a dinner party, the murmur and rise of the conversation, the many voices in their talk, the small music of the silver on the china, the servants moving quietly, the whole soft roar of a table in full flow, filling the warm golden room. It was a world complete, the dinner, a world of light and warmth and abundance and talk, sealed against the dark and the cold, and the want beyond the curtained windows, and to sit within it, in the candlelight, fed and warm and among the company, was to be at the very heart of the comfortable Victorian world, in the place where it was most itself, most abundant, most secure, most golden. That was the pleasure of the dinner, real beneath all the anxiety and the labor and the judgment, the pleasure of the warm golden room and the abundance and the company, and the diners felt it, even as they worked at the trial of the evening. the deep sensory pleasure of the candlelit table in the warm room against the dark. Through the whole of this long golden evening, there is a world you have barely glimpsed, the world just beyond the dining room door and down the stairs, where the other half of the dinner was happening, the world of the servants, whose evening was as long as yours and infinitely harder. Consider the butler, if the household ran to one, the senior man who commanded the whole service of the dinner, standing behind the host's chair, directing the servants with small, silent signals, overseeing the whole flow of the meal, responsible for the wines and their serving, and the smooth running of the entire operation. His evening was one of continuous, concentrated work, the managing of the service, the pouring of the wines, the watching of every guest's needs, the coordination of the whole team, all of it done with the perfect, impassive calm that his position required, his face betraying nothing, his whole bearing that of a man for whom the great dinner was simply the correct performance of his ordinary duty. Consider the servants who carried and served, moving in their practiced order around the table, presenting each dish at the correct side, serving each guest, clearing each course, carrying the endless procession of plates and dishes between the kitchen and the dining room, all evening, at the sustained pace the many courses demanded, in the tight coordination that the service required, silent and correct and invisible, trained to be present and unnoticed, to serve without being seen, to be a smooth functioning part of the machinery of the meal, and never a person in their own right in the diner's eyes. Their feet ached, no doubt, by the end of the long evening. Their arms grew tired with the carrying, and they worked on, through the whole of it in the correct silence, their own hunger and tiredness set aside, until the last guest had gone and the last plate was cleared, and the long labor of the clearing up could begin, the labor that would keep them working long after the diners had gone home to bed. And consider, far below in the hot kitchen, the cook and her helpers, who had produced this whole enormous meal, and whose evening, if anything, was the hardest of all. The intense, concentrated frenzy of the cooking, the many dishes all to be ready at their moments, the timing and the coordination, and the sheer physical labor of it, in the heat of the kitchen, over the coal range, through the whole long service. And when the cooking was done, the vast labor of the cleaning, the mountain of pots and pans and dishes, the scouring and the washing that a dinner of many courses left behind, the kitchen to be set to rights, all of it to be done before the exhausted staff could climb at last to their beds in the small hours, to snatch a few hours of sleep before the whole round of the ordinary day began again in the cold morning. The golden dinner in the candle-lit room rested, every plate and glass of it, on this hard, hidden labor below, and the pleasure of the diners was bought, hour by hour, with the toil of the servants, whose evening held none of the golden warmth and all of the work. The gentlemen rejoined the ladies at last, the host judging the moment and leading the men through from the dining room to the drawing room, where the ladies have taken their coffee and waited, and the whole party comes together again for the final phase of the evening, the gathering in the drawing room that followed the dinner. Here the mood eased a little from the strict formality of the table. Coffee was taken, and tea, and the conversation flowed more freely in the drawing room than it had in the ordered ranks of the dinner table. There might be music, one of the ladies going to the piano, a song or a piece performed for the company, the accomplishment displayed that we have met before in the Victorian evening. There was conversation, in the easier groupings that the drawing room allowed, the guests mingling more freely than the fixed order of the table had permitted. It was the winding down of the evening, the pleasant social coda after the great trial of the dinner, and it lasted an hour or so, The company gathered in the drawing room in the last of the evening, before the time came, as it must, for the guests to take their leave. And the leaving too had its rules, its correct forms of thanks and farewell, its proper timing, for one did not stay too late, and the departure of the principal guest was often the signal for the rest to follow. The carriages were called for those who kept them, or the cabs summoned, and the guests took their leave of their hosts, the thanks and the farewells exchanged, the wraps and the coats brought, and one by one the party dispersed into the night, out from the warm golden house, into the dark and the cold, carried home through the sleeping town, to their own houses and their own beds. And behind them the house they left began the long labor of its restoration, the servants falling on the wreckage of the great dinner, the clearing and the washing, and the setting to rights that would go on into the small hours, so that the house might be itself again by morning, and the enormous evening leave no trace but the memory of it, and the standing, raised or lowered, that it had won or lost. So that was the Victorian dinner party, from the arrival in the drawing room to the departure into the night, and I hope, having sat through the whole of it, course by course and rule by rule, you can see now how much more it was than the golden and abundant scene of the popular picture. It was, as we said at the start, the great trial, and we have seen why. Every moment of it was a test, of the hosts and of the guests, of breeding and wealth and the command of 1,000 rules, conducted under the constant quiet scrutiny of the table, with real stakes of social standing riding on the outcome. It was a feat of endurance, the long succession of courses and wines, the sustained performance of correct behavior and pleasant conversation, hour after hour, without a moment's release. It was a display of the family's wealth and standing, spoken in the language of food and wine, and silver and glass and jewels, an expensive and elaborate statement of belonging. And it was, beneath all of that, a great deal of hidden work, the labor of the cook and the servants below, the anxious management of the hostess, the whole enormous effort of production that lay behind the smooth and pleasant surface. And yet, let us be fair to it, as we let it go, for it was not only ordeal and display and labor. There was real pleasure in it too, and real value. The pleasure of the abundance, the fine food and the good wine, genuinely enjoyed. The pleasure of the warm golden room, the candlelight and the company, the deep sensory richness of the scene. The pleasure of good conversation, of wit and company, and the meeting of minds across the table, and the real social value of the thing, the maintaining and the making of the bonds of friendship and connection on which a whole social world was built, the bringing together of people in the pleasant ceremony of the shared meal, which is one of the oldest and best of all human institutions, beneath all the Victorian elaboration of it. The dinner was a trial, but it was also a pleasure and a communion, and the diners felt all of it, the anxiety and the pleasure, together, the work and the enjoyment intertwined. But the trial was real, and the labor was real, and the whole glittering evening rested, as everything in that world rested, on a great deal of effort that was carefully hidden and a great deal of inequality that was carefully unseen. The abundance on the table was bought with the labor of the servants below and set against the want of the poor beyond the windows. The effortless ease of the evening was the product of enormous effort concealed. The whole golden scene was a construction, built with great labor and great expense to look like the most natural and pleasant thing in the world, and the looking natural was the hardest part of all. That was the Victorian genius, and the Victorian burden, the making of the immensely effortful appear effortless. and nowhere was it more fully on display than at the dinner table in the great trial of the dinner party, where everyone worked so hard all evening at the labor of appearing to be at ease. So picture it one last time as we let the evening go. The guests gone into the night, the candles guttering low in the emptied dining room, the great table in its wreckage, the cloth stained, the glasses drained, the flowers drooping, the whole glittering scene collapsed into the debris of the finished feast. And below, the servants beginning the long clearing, and above, the hosts climbing wearily to bed, going over the evening in their minds, the small triumphs and the small disasters, the whole great trial survived for another season. The candlelight fades, the room goes dark, and the long, abundant, anxious, golden evening, the great trial of the Victorian dinner party, comes at last to its end. Sleep well.